Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Welcome to the Forum seminar series. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Gemma Sharp, and I'm an Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Exeter, and I run the Forum Consortium, with the M standing for menarche, menstruation, menopause, and mental health. So one of the main purposes of Forum is to encourage and to support interdisciplinary research. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by Professor Bettina Bildhauer, who is a professor of modern languages at the University of St Andrews. And Bettina's research, she researches the medieval history of menstruation, the recent Ending Period Poverty campaign in Scotland, and the stigma that's still attached to sustainable menstrual products. And today, Bettina is going to be talking to us about eco-shaming of those who do not use sustainable menstrual products, and is going to use her research in that area as an example of how important humanities approaches and techniques are to making progress in menstrual health research and practices. So Bettina's going to speak for about 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, and then
30
minutes.
Sorry.
And then there's going to be some time at the end for questions. So please pop your questions in the chat, and I'll go through them at the end, or if you'd prefer to ask them directly, then I'll just ask you to unmute during the Q&A session at the end. So yeah, I'll now pass over to Bettina. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Then it's really, really nice to speak to a group outside the usual kind of humanities crowds. I'm assuming that most of you are scientists of some description, so I try to really make this relevant on interdisciplinarity. So super pleased to have you. I think 4M is really exciting. I'm sorry if this is not long enough, but I always feel like I'm much clearer or better at getting to the nub of an issue in dialogue. So that's why I always keep the discussion part as long as possible and the presentation part fairly swift. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. There we are. Gemma, can you give me a thumbs up? Working? Cool. Here we go. So, as Gemma said, I am at the University of St Andrews in Modern Languages, but I'm also one of the founders of the Menstruation Research Network UK. The main founder, I guess, is the fabulous Camilla Rostvik, who's now at the University of Agder in Norway. So this is the start of our website. We're like a loose grouping of people in lots of different areas working on the menstrual life cycle. There's a photo of us there at our last conference, which happened in May in St Andrews, where Gemma and I think Chloe and Sally and some others were at. Actually, Sally couldn't make it, sorry. The next annual conference of our network is in Liverpool on the 29th of May next year. So little plug there. You'd be more than welcome to attend. It's a lovely interdisciplinary group. The impression that I'm getting, in part from MRN and from working in this space, is that the state of menstrual cycle research is at a bit of a crossroads. So from my perspective, I would say there's still huge areas where we don't even have the most basic knowledge, and that includes medical knowledge, physiological knowledge, dealing with menstrual problems. They're like vast areas that are not researched. But at the same time, I think we sometimes ask the same questions over and over again. And in particular, in my area concerning menstrual stigma, I feel that many studies confirm what we already know, just in slightly different contexts. So the huge persistence of menstrual stigma in all sorts of areas. And not just amongst as academics do we ask the same thing. Also, nothing ever changes in the real world. The knowledge that we have about menstrual stigma doesn't translate into it getting any looser or doesn't translate into social change. And that reminds me of what a lot of my scientist colleagues are saying about climate change. We have abundant evidence for how the climate is changing for the worse, and it still doesn't seem to filter down into concrete actions. or, you know, spread into, even within academia, into all the areas that need to be concerned. So for menstrual studies, I wonder where this stagnation comes from. And I think part of it is simply the nature of the topic, and we can't do anything about this. So it is a stigmatized area precisely because it's stigmatized. It is difficult to find funding to get the basic research done. And I'm saying this as somebody who, as Gemma kindly said, is trained as a medievalist, so somebody who studies really old texts, really obscure in German. It's a lot easier to find funding for these things than for anything to do with menstruation, because people in power who control the money flow still think that menstruation is a niche topic. We've had that feedback many times, and is somehow yucky and disgusting. And so the stigma affects the researchers as much as people who do menstruate, although, you know, a lot of us are both. So my colleague Lara Owen has done a study on this, published in 2019, on the effects of the researchers in being in the stigmatized area, although she's also found that things are changing a little bit for the better. So it is an emerging field, and I think in those areas you also always have a fair bit of repetition at the start. We don't have the institutional structures for critical menstruation studies yet that other areas have. If I want to do research in my area of German literature, I know the journals, I know the departments, I know the colleagues. This menstruation studies is still genuinely interdisciplinary. There isn't a particular body of knowledge or organized form of knowledge to which you can go. Also, I think we have to admit that it can actually be quite advantageous to be in a new area and to be able to say, oh, I'm taboo breaking. So every study claims to break the taboo anew, because that is also a way of attracting attention and of, I guess, in a way, attracting funding and making your research better known. So we slightly profit from this underdog status as well. And sometimes I'm guilty of this too, sometimes overstate the novelty of what we do. Oops. Not letting me move on. There we go. So on a sort of more hopeful note, I think that interdisciplinary research is beginning to move things forward from the same questions being repeated over and over again. I think we currently have built up some momentum for new research and new research collaborations coming forward. Certainly at the MRN conference, and, you know, in various menstrual networks around the world, and then from what I gather in 4M, it's the same. There's a real spirit of collaboration, of sharing knowledge as opposed to competing with each other. People who are in menstrual studies don't tend to be in it for the ego and for the prestige, right? Most of us are in it because we care. A lot of us have menstrual issues ourselves. You know, there does seem to be a prevalence of feminist collaborative working practices there, which I think is really exciting and we can really build on. And I started researching menstruation 20 years ago for my PhD, and it wasn't there. I really think this is a new thing, and it is a moment that we can use. We also have the beginnings of institutional structures in the field of critical menstruation studies. So I've put on the side there the Palgrave handbook that came out, that was really galvanizing and wrote together, you know, like it was a useful sort of starting point to say, like, there is a field now out there. The Journal of Women's Reproductive Health is actually much older, was kind of mostly medical focused, and is beginning to get a lot more interdisciplinary. It's published by the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, who are also one of the institutional structures that have been around for a while and that are growing and gaining momentum. They run a biennial conference in the US. Our menstruation research network in the UK runs the annual conference, although I have to say next year is the last year that we have funding for, so we're looking for new options from then on, but I'm determined to keep it a regular thing because it's so useful. And then, of course, there's the 4M network, which I think is the first big UK-based network on menstruation, so congratulations to you guys for making that happen. I would say overall, however, though, this interdisciplinary research is still dominated by the sciences, the social sciences, the medical sciences in particular, which is not a bad thing, because menstruation is seen largely as a medical issue in contemporary Western societies, but we could do more, I think. Again, it's slightly sticky. There we go. So in particular, I want to make the case, because I am from the humanities, to say today how humanities perspectives can help move the interdisciplinary research forward and maybe allow a move away from the same old research questions, not because we're better, just because we're different in some ways. So in particular, we have different methods. One of our core slightly artificial speaking for the humanities as a whole, but if we are to generalize, one of our core strengths is to be able to deal with language, to really understand language use, the unconscious biases, the emotions that come through, even if we have the best of intentions. Even, you know, myself in the way I speak about menstruation, I tend to do this layer of distancing as the academic rather than the menstruator and so on. And we then also have the methods to show how we can communicate better in ways that are maybe less stigmatizing. We also use a particular set of sources that can be really valuable to understand menstruation. So much of the work, some of it is non-fictional sources, but much of the work in the humanities disciplines works with creative writing, with art, with cultural products by people who have a particular talent for expressing their lived experience, so they can be really insightful about what it's like to menstruate in ways that, you know, speaking to a regular person doing an interview might not. And in particular, they're often really good at imagining alternatives to how it is at the moment. So thinking about menstruation as something that can maybe an empowering experience, can be powerful, is not so strongly gendered as it is today. So that can be really an inspirational body of sources to work with, texts, a corpus of the products that we look at. Humanities tend also to have a slightly longer temporal range than a lot of the sciences. So most scientists' work, just again generalizing, is focused on the present and goes out of date very quickly, which is right. You know, we all live in the present moment, but sometimes it can be helpful to have a longer temporal range and perspective. In particular, again, when it comes to menstrual stigma, to understand just how deep the roots are. Something that's been around for millennia is not going to swiftly change because we bring in a new policy. So some of that understanding and how deeply the devaluation of women and of bodies is in most cultures can help explain the tenacity of the stigma and of the patterns of thinking. We also in the humanities tend to use a particular set of critical theories that are sometimes overlapping with those scientists use, but sometimes different. So we're overall, broadly speaking, good at generalizing, at big picture thinking, and asking really fundamental philosophical or ethical questions. So overall, just some different perspectives there maybe to consider. And just to give you some examples of the kinds of things that someone who's essentially a layperson, somebody with a humanities background like myself, finds interesting when it comes to scientific research. So this is my observations largely from a fabulous overview article that Hilary Critchley did in Edinburgh with lots of interdisciplinary scientists. And to me, from a humanities and I guess popular perspective, what really struck me as important to highlight, to do more research, but also just to publicize better in terms of the existing research that we already have, is something that you guys probably talk about all the time, which is that we sort of overemphasize the menstrual bleed, and we neglect to say that actually the menstrual cycle and the menstrual life cycle, for the most part, is a positive rather than a negative. For the most part, boosts your performance, certainly in the first half of the cycle, boosts your health, boosts your mood. So it's not a loss and a suffering and akin to illness and problems in the way we often see it. The second point that blew my mind when I first heard it was that menstrual blood contains stem cells, right? We go to such length to extricate stem cells for therapies from bone marrow, really like dangerous operations, when we could have them for free in a substance that's essentially flushed away most of the time. that would be so valuable for research, but also for treatments, right? And that is because it's disgusting and people don't want to contemplate it and labs don't want to handle it, right? So, you know, to me, that's a huge, huge area where science could do more research and could communicate better. Third one is that the menstrual cycle must have an evolutionary advantage. I did not know this either, that only so few species menstruate and most of them are primates. So if the people, the species at the top of the tree, if we want to think hierarchically, menstruate, it must be, you know, really, really positive. Again, not talked about, and it's obviously still a hypothesis at this stage. And finally, however we individually feel about reproduction, it is one of the most astonishing things that some human bodies can do to perpetuate the species, and the menstrual cycle is essential to that. And I really like the understanding, which I think is beginning to emerge as medical consensus or physiological consensus, that menstruation is not there because it's a failed pregnancy, which is the way that it's represented in the humanities, in textbooks, in popular culture exclusively, which is the womb prepares for a baby, and if there isn't a baby, you know, the lining that's been built up is wasted and flushed out. I think the medical idea is that it's the opposite of that, that it enables the body to get rid of unviable pregnancies that would be dangerous for the mother or the fetus. So just some ideas of what I find interesting from a humanities perspective, but what I want to spend the rest of the presentation today talking about is one particular example of how my colleague Lara Owen and I, who's a social scientist, work together to come up with an interdisciplinary study about a recent menstrual issue as an example of maybe the kinds of questions you can ask, the kinds of findings you make, but also, of course, the limitations. So this was an article that we published in Women's Reproductive Health earlier this year. It was funded by the Scottish Funding Council, and it was on Scottish policy making. Gemma already mentioned that there's a lot going on in Scotland at the moment. Activists and politicians have really made great strides in trying to combat menstrual stigma, trying to fund education campaigns, making period products freely available. So we studied this complex of texts, this discourse, to see what the sort of new trends were emerging. And what we found is that despite everyone's best intentions, the stigma just perpetuates itself, but in different forms, although there's also good movements towards progress. So I'm giving you an example of how this works here, just to let you know a little bit more about my particular specialism. So I can't speak for all the humanities. I am a particular kind of humanities researcher. So I study medieval attitudes to menstruation, amongst other things, mostly the 13th century. The sources that I look at are mostly written in German or in Latin, although medieval European culture and actually Asian and North African culture was really connected. So it doesn't really make sense to look at one particular language area in isolation. I also look at texts in other languages, often in translation, because it was part of a similar culture, and the attitudes to menstruation didn't vary between English-speaking or German-speaking areas to a great extent. I look at a wide range of genres of texts because, relatively speaking, we have so few books surviving from the Middle Ages. So you really have to be interdisciplinary or very broad-based if you're a medieval studies person. So I look at medical texts, fictional texts, legal texts, devotional religious texts, to kind of get a picture of patterns that emerge across these different genres. And I also look at visual sources, again, because of a lot of the texts were illustrated, and also because it is just more material to understand. The theories that I particularly use are mostly gender studies, the history of bodies, the conceptualization of bodies, new materialism, so questions about the differentiation between humans and the environment and what matter is as opposed to immateriality, and queer theory. So in this article, Lara Owen and I used 3 theoretical concepts that we derived from humanities research, but also social sciences research. And the first one is what we call the containment ideal. So we invented this term, even though the concept is well known in feminist body studies and in new materialism. We mostly borrow from Karen Barrett here. And the sort of general idea of containment has been used in menstruation studies before as well. So the point is that the body, we tend to think of our embodied selves as separate from an outside, as having a coherent identity that ends at the skin. But Barrett points out that this is not actually a given at all, that it's learned in culturally specific ways that vary from culture to culture. So babies, when they're born, have to learn to conceive of their contours and their self as separate from an outside. It's not something we're born with. People who have visual impairments, when they're first, if they have an operation that allows them to see again, they also have to learn to perceive contours as something that separates them from an outside. When you look at a body under a microscope, optically, it's actually a refraction of bands as opposed to a clear boundary. When you look at it on a molecular level, you can't say which molecule is part of the outside and which part is still of the body. So on a material level, but also on a semantic level, the body is not automatically a given unit that's separate from the outside. Instead, we construct it culturally to be such. And it takes a lot of culture work to uphold this. And this is, we achieve this through the ideal of containment, through pretending that it's that we are enclosed entities that are not in constant exchange with other species with an outside, that don't have millions of bacteria, whose body weight isn't made up mostly of other organisms living in and around our bodies and skins. So we try to see ourselves as enclosed containers rather than in exchange. And the way we police this is in part through the concealment imperative. So that's our second theoretical framework. That's quite well established in critical menstruation studies. Jill Wood in the Progress Handbook coined the term recently, but the idea has been around for a long time, that people have to try to hide menstrual blood at all costs, and the fact that they are menstruating. So blood must not be seen, heard, smelled, touched, tasted. Oh my God. So it's something that has come out of the body that shows you that, you're not an enclosed pure container, that you are in exchange with an outside. Like little bits can come out of you into the surroundings. That's why it's scary, and that's why it's beset with taboos and hidden. The third related concept to that is this idea of pollution, so that the boundaries, the outer limits of your body are something that needs to be protected, and pollution is something that has traversed this boundary, that has come from the inside to the outside, that confuses these categories. So menstrual blood, excrement, semen, bodily fluids are all, difficult to conceptualize because they're both you and not you. They're both inside and can come outside. So this is a concept that was mostly developed a long time ago, actually, by the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who defined polluting substances as matter out of place and identified that a lot of rituals around purity and of trying to place things under a taboo and keep them hidden are to do with the protection of these boundaries. She linked this to the sense that individual bodies often symbolize or stand for social bodies. So societies who are concerned about protecting their purity, their separateness from other societies, tend to have particularly strong prohibitions around bodily boundaries. I actually think it's mostly not about the societies, it is about the individual bodies who are not given either. But this is kind of the complex of related theories that we use that are scientific and humanities based. Now, what do we do with this? So the sources that we have, I already mentioned, are these contemporary Scottish documents. So the first sort of group of texts is the Scottish Period Products Act, which was the act that allowed or placed an obligation on local councils to make period products freely available to everyone who needs them. And then the debates in Parliament around this and the minutes from the committees, the parliamentary committees that worked on this. The second was a report that the Scottish government commissioned on marine litter. So Scotland identified that it has a higher rate of marine litter in the sea than England and other nations, and looked particularly into 4 types of litter, and menstrual products were one of them. So tampons, tampon applicators, the kind of the parts of pads that are made from plastic that persists, that end up through sewage in the marine environment. The third one was a report on reusable menstrual products that was also commissioned by the Scottish government, trying to encourage the use of washable underwear, pads, or menstrual cups, and try to understand the barriers against their use in contemporary Scotland. And then finally, we also spoke to some of the authors and campaigners on these reports. So this to me is like not a typical set of humanities sources. It's very much a social science set of sources. But what we used in terms of methods with this were literary study methods. So the stuff that I'm trained in and do. And it's called textual analysis or close reading. All it means is you pay really close attention to the way things are expressed, what kind of word choices people make, how they construct their sentences, their syntax, what they emphasize, what kind of value judgments come through, what emotions they express. It's not a quantitative analysis of particular speech patterns as you get in discourse analysis. It's a bit more rounded than that. I'll give you some examples in a minute. So our key finding was that the sort of effort to tackle the use of single-use menstrual products, both from an environmental perspective, so to combat marine litter, but also on an individual perspective, to think about it from a consumer perspective, that despite this being really well-intentioned, it still reproduced menstrual stigma in new ways. And this was, in a nutshell, because the idea shifted from menstrual blood being seen as a pollutant, as something dirty, as something disgusting, dangerous, to the products, the single-use products being seen as an environmental pollutant. And I'm going to trace how this works now. So our first finding was one of the ones that really isn't surprising. Most of you will have expected this, we expected to find this, which is that menstrual blood is still seen as disgusting in 21st century Scotland. It's worth briefly pausing on, but mostly I'm introducing it here because we then see the same patterns used about the non-sustainable products. So menstrual blood was described as polluting across the sources that we saw. Unhygienic was a term frequently used. So the reusable products report, for example, states that many first had to overcome an initial distaste for the idea of handling and washing bloody products, with many thinking of this as unhygienic and gross. So blood is still disgusting as unhygienic, unsanitary. It's also polluting in the sense of being a waste, not so much the waste of a pregnancy here, but the used products were seen as waste, as something to be disposed of. And also there was a discourse around a waste of money. Would sustainable products be a waste of money? Perhaps more importantly for us is that the containment idea, again, also came out really strongly. So blood was seen as something that violates this notion of an enclosed body. And that kind of defies categories. Is this matter out of place, as Mary Douglas would put it? So there was like a really exaggerated concern with keeping bloodied products away from other waste or other laundry. That has nothing to do with practicalities and all to do with like needing to enforce separation. So the marine litter report said that some users may not wish to put their disposable menstrual products in the bathroom bin, as this would contaminate other objects in the bin, preventing them from being recycled. So this is couched as like an environmental concern, wanting to be a good citizen and recycle your stuff, but actually it's like some waste is dirtier than others. Menstrual waste is dirtier than others. Or similarly, period washable pads and underwear were seen as not being allowed to touch other laundry. So people were thinking they might need to use a wash bag around that, but even that might not be enough to contain these products. And finally, the concealment imperative was also still strong. So the greatest barrier to sustainable products that people reported were that they would have to touch their own menstrual blood, see their own menstrual blood, or, as the report says, worst case scenarios in which others may see the used pad were discussed in horror. So now the crucial thing that happens is there is also a shift of concern. This persists, this concern with individual blood as a pollutant persists, but also there's now a concern as on a macro level, as the nation the outer boundaries of a social body being polluted by menstrual products. So it's a different issue, but the same pattern. So blood is not seen as a pollutant in itself anymore, but the products that then wash up into the sea, and in particular onto beaches, are seen as environmental pollutants. So they become plastic pollution, they become a problem for the environment. This is couched again in terms of it being waste and being litter. Also, the phrase leakage is used, which is something we wouldn't usually use for plastic objects. That maybe shows that it comes from the same pattern of thinking. And for me, the most interesting thing was, again, that this violates a containment ideal, also on the level of nations. So the location where these plastic products in sewage, the applicators, the tampons, the pads, pose a problem is not in the sea. I'm looking out at the sea just now, is not in the marine environment, is not being ingested by sea life. It's on the beaches, right? It's on the sort of outer edge of the landmass that makes Scotland. And it's particularly a visual disamenity, as the report has it. So it's something that should not be seen. It's something that has to be concealed. The issues were that it would put tourists off, it would put locals off. It doesn't look nice, right? It violates this imperative to always keep menstruation hidden. In the parliamentary debates, there was a really disproportionate concern around the boundaries of this nation in which products would be freely exchanged now, free for everyone, circulated, having free access. That was the term often used. And one of the things that the press picked up on in particular was the question that Parliament debated as to how you would keep the Scottish-English land border enclosed here, so that English people wouldn't come and travel to Scotland, take free menstrual products and travel back to England. So we have a similar concern here with keeping an enclosed entity and keeping these boundaries policed. So the eco-shaming of users of disposable products reproduces menstrual stigma on an individual level. We already knew this. We already knew that stigma was hard to shift. So Victoria Newton in 2016 observes everyday discourses on menstruation and practices of menstruation. And she says the prospect of having to consider using a greener, safer option to save the world one flow at a time is just another burden to bear. So this idea that you are obliged to be a good citizen by using sustainable products actually just puts more pressures on menstruators. But beyond that, we found that beyond this individual level, the same patterns of containment and concealment of anything to do with menstruation have developed a new level by us now also having to conceal the used menstrual products in the sewage. So that the responsibility is still not placed on the water companies that let the sewage out. The responsibility is placed on a national level and on an individual level. We end our article with the options that this actually allows us to dislodge a bit of menstrual stigma. So there is the shift. Menstrual stigma sticks. It's found a new form of now being about nations and about environmental pollutants. But that also means that some of the old stigma as the option of being loosened, because it's not the blood. None of the reports ever mention the menstrual blood that gets washed up into the sea. This is different in some contexts in the global south, where there is a concern with this. No mention of this whatsoever in Scotland. The blood is fine. It's the plastic in the products that is an issue. But I think we can turn this around as well and more broadly acknowledge that this ideal of containment and of purity, and that there is a fully enclosed body that is not an exchange, that doesn't leak, that doesn't emit fluids, is an illusion, right? And not even a desirable illusion. In the same way, we can think about the environment as, if we always have this idea that we can go back to a time where there was no plastic pollution whatsoever and we can keep it pure. Now that time never existed, and humans are part of the environment. We're not separate who can then destroy something. We are part of this, and maybe seeing humans and environment as entangled and always already polluted and leaking and blending into each other gives us new perspectives on environmental damage and practical steps of changing this as well. One practical step that it certainly allows us is to, if menstrual stigma can be moved from the individual to the nation, we could also look at the mid-level and actually see that you know, maybe we should ask where these products come from, not in terms of what their national origin is, which sometimes also occurred in the debate, like, you know, menstrual products washed up from far-flung nations, but actually from which factories they come and which companies produce them. And then you could think about extended producer responsibility for getting rid of these products, or you know, finding sensible ways of disposing them as opposed to just washing them up, letting them wash up on beaches. Max Lebaron and their team in Canada has done great work on how this might work in terms of marine pollution, just thinking differently. But also, I think the fact that menstrual stigma persists and that a whole area of research is tainted by this is not necessarily a negative. It is, you know, I've already said it can be quite productive to be always be able to claim that you're taboo breaking, right? But for instance, queer studies really agonizes about having become too institutionalized, too established, just another box to tick, not radical anymore. And I think with menstrual studies, you can really say that the stigma is still there, and it helps to keep the research honest and not profiteering. So my final point and final slide just takes us back to the start, away from the case study to a broader picture. What could interdisciplinary research, including the humanities, actually bring to menstrual studies more broadly? So I think it can bring new, or at least different theories and questions, such as where does a body end, you know, where does embodied identity end? How can we think of humans as entangled with the environment and not as two entirely separate categories? So undoing a lot of the work that the Enlightenment has done conceptually. It can bring new frameworks and concepts, such as the ones I talked about today, the containment ideal, a concealment imperative on pollution. It can bring new sources that describe lived experience in new ways, art, literature, film, and so on. It can bring new or different methods, such as the textual analysis that I exemplified today, that could really be used for medical and scientific texts as well, for research published, for textbooks, for patient leaflets, and so on. But really, this is the area of your expertise, or our expertise at a groups, not mine. So you tell me what you think, how we can work together with a humanities perspective, and I'd be so glad to think about future collaborations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bettina. That was so fascinating, and thanks for explaining it all so clearly and simply as well, because I think it takes a lot of like your own kind of like brain power to kind of be thinking in these different theoretical perspectives, and to try and I mean, just the stuff that you presented on like body as a container, I was like, yeah, that's kind of how I see it. Like, you know, and I've never heard like people present any kind of counter argument to that, and so it's really interesting to see it kind of described, and yeah, it definitely, I think, helps to make you really think about your own research and how it would kind of fit within those different frameworks.
Brilliant. Exactly what I was hoping, you know, and it is really hard to see your own preconceptions of your field and to put that into words. You know, I'm always like, oh, why do people think in modern languages all we do is like teach grammar, right? But then it's, of course, we don't particularly verbalize very well what we do at all. So
yeah, I think that's what I really loved about coming to the Menstruation Research Network meeting, actually, is that you're just presented with all these kind of different perspectives and ideas that you just haven't really entertained, and you can go through essentially a whole career without really thinking about. So that's what I find really fascinating about interdisciplinary research. But it's difficult to kind of make those jumps. Are there any questions from anybody? Sally's got some comments in the chat. Sally, shall I give you the power to unmute? There we go. Oh,
hello.
Hey.
Hi, Bettina. I really enjoyed that. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, my comments are, I was really interested in the stuff about disgust. So I've looked into this a little bit, mainly on the blog. But to me, I think it describes, that matter out of place and leaky bodies describes a lot of the stigma, but it doesn't completely describe it, because, for instance, we do have semen stains and poo stains and vomit stains on clothes, and we haven't got societies designed around stigma against those particular stains, which we do see around menstrual stains or menstruation as a thing. So I guess there's something about how, for me, being a member of various different networks, it would be great for more medical sciences, biomedical sciences, biology, to read this critical literature, basically starting off with the textbook, the Palgrave Macmillan textbook. It's so useful because it will just, as you were just saying, Gemma, trip your mind every time you read a certain word or a metaphor being used by medical research. You'll think, oh, hang on, this is actually slightly shaming or slightly sexist, or this comes from the idea of this and that and the other. So I think you're right. We really need to not just collaborate, but read across and sort of educate ourselves on what's already out there. There is some really, really good stuff out there. For sure.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for confirming that point, Sally. I'm just thinking, you know, because I do try to read medical stuff, but I find it really hard to understand. You know, some bits are easy, like the first bit, the abstract, I usually get, right? But then when it gets into the details, there's just so much assumed knowledge, right? So maybe we actually need to like help each other understand the frameworks of each discipline, right? Maybe we need like an interdisciplinary reading group where we translate.
I think that's exactly what we need, because I'm exactly the same, but with humanities and I guess to a lesser extent some social science research, where I'm like, I really want to understand this, but we just write in very different ways and use different language, and yeah, like you say, there's a lot of assumed knowledge in the reader. So I've got the Palgrave Handbook of Critical Menstruation Studies. It's very big. You know, if there was some kind
short chapters, super short chapters.
if we had some way of like, I guess just talking to each other a bit more, and then being able to say like, oh, I really don't understand what you meant by this. Can you know, when I say this, is it sexist? That sort of thing. Actually, that like just being really open about that could be really useful, I think. I taught a course on reproductive mental health last term, and I feel like just from saying stuff out loud to another group of people and trying to explain it, I just learned so many other things and different perspectives and things, and that was to a group of psychology students. So I feel like if we were talking between disciplines, like we'd do a lot of learning.
Yeah, and it's important not to, you know, I tend to go like, oh yeah, scientists, as if you all speak the same language, right? It's like, you know, of course, each science has completely different conventions and traditions and ways of expressing. But also, Sally, to come back to your point about the gender aspect of it, is like you know, the devaluation of bodies is terrible for people of all genders, right? But there is, you know, the menstrual taboo and the menstruation issue is based so deeply in misogyny in particular, right? And it is important to keep saying that and keep seeing that. And although, you know, in my period in the Middle Ages, there was also, you know, this idea that Jewish men menstruate, which mixes misogyny and anti-Semitism, right? So it's never just against women, but it being against women is, I think, the foundation of it all.
Yeah, it's the othering, basically. This is an embodied othering.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree that matter out of place that's how we learn it and how we normalize it, because we do that for lots of other things, including helpful things, like you're saying, learning how to be afraid of certain things and that will keep us safe. But yeah, I always use this as an example, you know, pen inks, that they can stain your shirt, but you can walk around with ink on your shirt and be absolutely fine. People might just make a couple of jokes, but if you walk around with a red stain down by your crotch area, it's a completely different matter.
Now Maria put her camera on, and has their hand up, and I would like to give you the option to unmute, but it doesn't seem to be letting me, which is a bit of a problem. Let me just take off the setting where I've dictated that no one can speak.
I think it's let me unmute now, but
oh, great. Thanks.
I don't know if someone else had their hand up first. I can put my camera.
I think you can go ahead, Hat, and I'll try and unmute Maria.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for that. That was like so interesting, and as Gemma said, like really well explained, because I've like read stuff, but it just goes in better. I was kind of wondering, so it's kind of it's more sort of me just reflecting in the context of my own research. So I'm looking at I'm doing like a survivor-led research project looking at people's experiences of menstrual health in mental health wards. And kind of from the project, I'm looking at kind of doing the research, but also developing like guidance to kind of help inform change and stuff. And it's been really interesting, like how much people are focused on like bins. So because of kind of restrictions in wards and things, like there's a lot of items which people don't have access to, and it's like an environment which inherently compromises privacy and stuff. And people have been really concerned. So I don't actually, like, some of the restrictions are just really arbitrary, and it's just general like poor practice really. But often places don't have kind of closed bins, they have like open bins or cardboard bins and things. And people have been, you know, this has been something that people have been quite concerned about. And I kind of wondered how I've been kind of struggling to have the balance of looking at how we respond to that in a way that kind of recognizes that whilst people are incredibly unwell in hospital, isn't the time to be kind of challenging their views, but also not to reinforce them. So sorry, I'm not sure if I explained that very well. But
the bins are an issue where so many of the discourses like crystallize, because again, I think it's something concrete and material, right? And it's, you know, I think there is a balance to be struck between the need for privacy and wanting protection, but also not kind of, like you say, reinforcing stereotypes that it's only women who need bins, and that menstrual blood is something disgusting that needs to be hidden away completely, right? And I would say, like, you know, in a hospital setting, I would on the side of the patient's needs or the survivor's needs, right? Whereas I would say in our regular day-to-day settings, that might be a point of putting menstrual bins as much as menstrual products in all gendered bathrooms, for instance, or maybe even not in bathrooms. Oh my God, you know, openly visible. But it's like, it is one of the most controversial areas. And of course, Camilla Roswick has done a whole history of the sanitary bin, because the other side of this is actually the protection of the workers, right? And I'm saying this as somebody who had to do an HIV test after hurting herself on a hospital bin sort of syringe, right? It's you know, you also have to respect the kind of case made for laborers not wanting to or workers not wanting to be endangered in contact with this. I think in the global north broadly, we've reached a stage where we're beginning to see it more from the perspective of the menstruators, but I think in certain global south environments, especially in India, it is really empowering to say, like, no, you know, cleaning people don't want to be in touch with these products, and therefore bins or even bags within bins are something to be promoted. So I don't think there is like a right or a wrong solution. It always depends on the context and on, you know, listening to all sides and making these cases. But, you know, that's the advantage that we have as researchers. We can like look at it, something from all sides, and like take the time, and we have the language to express this and express why it's such a controversial issue as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really useful and interesting. Yeah, just randomly, I've also found places where they ask people to put like period products into clinical waste bins, which are specifically for like infectious waste, which is also like really stigmatizing in itself. But yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. Thanks.
All these incinerators, you know, that were really fashioned
Yeah.
in the 60s in schools, where it was classed as so dirty that it had to be like, you know, immediately incinerated. And even now, like,
Yeah.
you know, sanitary waste is classed and processed as different, although all hospital waste is anyway, right? So anyway, yeah.
Thanks. Maria, are you able to speak now? Yes.
Yes, I think so. Sorry, and I was like typing away, just looking at things. I was, yeah, it was just when you were talking about, you know, the need to try to, or the interest in trying to communicate across these kind of disciplinary sort of traditions, and I think like also just the languages that we use, and just like reading. It was more of a like, yeah, let's read some things together than try to work out like what assumptions are being made, you know, about them. And I suppose what feels interesting to me is just how some of the questions that might be asked in one space might help, you know, open up new areas for research in other spaces. And I know sometimes it's, you know, it's almost like there are two tracks and they're not really ever going to intersect. But you know, so you were talking about the question of the like containment kind of, you know, container body. And, you know, in a way, I feel like, you know, certainly in geography as well, in feminist geography, that's been something that's talked about a lot about, you know, how do bodies kind of get policed and, you know, not seen as fluid. And that's kind of actually like a space that needs to sort of be, you know, held all together. And I guess the question I always have in kind of trying to do these interdisciplinary conversations is like, if that's sort of an easier assumption that we all kind of have, like bodies are like containers, like what would it mean if we did research starting from a different set of assumptions? Like, would it actually change some of the science? Because I think in some ways, some of the insights might be interesting, but they, you know, do they actually generate some kind of change in how we think and how we might do research projects differently? So in a way, it's like, you know, we have interdisciplinarity, but then, you know, the kind of holy grail of like transdisciplinary, where we actually change the way we think about, you know, doing the research that we want to do because we've had these kind of cross-disciplinary conversations. You know, it's an interesting question, like, you know, and I don't know, on some level, I think sometimes as a kind of humanities social science scholar of reading that work, you know, you're not quite sure exactly what might change if you know, if scientists took up some of these other concepts. But yeah, I think really the first step is being receptive to having those conversations. So I'm like, yes, all for reading, not to add it to our list of things to do, but yeah, so it was more just like a comment and a supportive comment. I mean, I also had this moment where, and maybe it's just thinking about, you know, I wonder about some of the stigma that might be changing. So like, I mean, I think there is still a menstrual stigma, but I am just struck by how open some of the conversations seem to be becoming. And actually, you know, that may be about the, you know, about that sort of moment that you're suggesting we're in, which is like actually things are kind of opening up and people seem to be talking about some of these things. And maybe that's, you know, that's an opportunity to be in this space. But I am struck because I just taught some year 3 students, and it's a mixed group. I mean, there's probably fewer men than women, or self-identified men than self-identified women, I'm thinking, in the unit. But it was a very frank and open conversation about period trackers, you know, and people, like young women, talking about how they like actually period trackers, you know, using period trackers. I mean, that wasn't the focus of the conversation. But you know, I just feel like there's actually a kind of frankness about some of the things that we're talking about that I feel like feels very different from what, I mean, I would have like, and you know, I would have personally experienced when I was that age. And I don't know if that's, you know, if that's just a kind of you know, that feels like maybe a generational thing, and maybe it's due to all the efforts of those of us who've been trying to openly about menstrual, you know, menstruation and so on. And maybe it's also not like, yeah, it's probably a very specific group in that class. But yeah, it just strikes me that there are some things that maybe in a positive way are kind of changing too. So it was just, you know, how do we, so more comments than questions, really. But
thank you.
For a really great talk.
I loved it. So yes, on the changing stigma, absolutely. So Lara, in her article where she interviewed menstrual researchers, observed a shift from the early, so around 2010, I think she dates it, maybe a tiny bit earlier than that, to a greater openness, and researchers who sort of started post that date being much happier with the conditions. And yeah, you know, the year of the period and all this, I think things are moving in the right direction. But I think often it is the stigma just moving into other ways. So period, like products can be a really good way of opening up that conversation, right? But then it often just you know, while we talk openly about this, we still don't talk openly about, you know, our pains in the workplace or whatever it may be. They can shift. But like, I really like the idea. What if we try to do this properly? And I actually think what would change? And again, like we need to do this together. And if you were up for this, I would absolutely love this. You know, how can we conceive of medical research that starts from the point of view that the body doesn't exist, right? That it's all enmeshed. And, you know, I gather that a lot of this is happening with microorganisms in the body being used both to heal and their sort of, you know, benefits to health and you know, role in human health are increasingly being acknowledged. But again, that's like from an incredible layperson's perspective. But, you know, if anybody was up for like an interdisciplinary reading group, I would absolutely adore this. We've really struggled in MRN to get medical researchers involved, present company excluded, one of the few exceptions, because I think the language is so different, right? Or Hilary Critchley, who I mentioned, is one of the few people who will make the effort to speak cross languages, right? Because it's difficult. It's a real skill, right?
Awesome, thank you. I'm aware that we're like 1 minute to go, but Chloe has a hand up. So, if people need to leave, Bettina, do you need to leave immediately?
No, it's good. And I try to speak more slowly. Now we're out of time, the usual.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep everyone here longer.
No, I'm fine.
No, I kind of also maybe more just comment and we can discuss more after. But I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed it because I am an anthropologist by background, but I'm a medical anthropologist, and I have, doing my PhD at the moment, I have one supervisor in anthropology and one in social sciences and one supervisor in medical sciences in gynecology and women's and reproductive health. So like this translational work going between two very different disciplines with like very different expectations, and basically research that just starts from completely different points and expectations of what is conceived as valid, is like what I'm constantly trying to navigate. So I just wanted to kind of say thank you for talking about it. It's been really like joyful for me to hear, because also it's something that I'm still trying to like figure out how I can do well, because I do feel like a lot of my time I go to conferences with for medical sciences and like gynecologists and obstetricians, and you know, I rework everything to present it for a different audience, and sometimes I wonder like what I'm losing or what am I able to do well in that. So I think, yeah, it's a difficult space, and I think having that interdisciplinarity and yeah, and I think so. I was just going to say, Maria, when you were talking about how we can actually build that into action, like what would be done differently about research or something, I think it's interesting because you might have things, just something that came to mind, like when you might be like measuring how pain is measured in kind of like clinical lists or something. You might, if you have an expert in pain from like a social science perspective or a humanities perspective, knowing different things about how people experience pain, you might be able to put them into questions and things like that in a different way. It was just something that came to mind that I thought maybe that's one way, but I agree, it's hard to know what is a starting point of how things might actually look different. But yeah, so again, more of a comment, not a question, but I really enjoyed it.
But it's interesting that you mentioned these scales, because Varsha, who's here earlier, and Hilary, I think, you know, one of the things they're concerned about is that the question you ask in the questionnaires on which the research is based are already biased, right? So in a way, you only find out what you're asking for. So, you know, they were thinking about, again, like, can you frame, I guess it is, can you frame your approach differently? And can you, I think there are existing scales of the severity of menstrual issues as well that you could then change. But I think, Chloe, like, you are the future, right? Guys like you are embodiedly trying to bring disciplines together, and it is so hard. And what's particularly hard about it is what comes after the PhD, right? You've got this body of knowledge, but which department do you then fit into? Where do you get your job, right? So you're forced back into your little silo.
Yeah, something I will look forward to. But thank you, it was really interesting.
Awesome, great, thanks everyone. Yeah, really brilliant talk. Thanks again, Bettina. Yeah, we'll be back in November for 2 seminars in the same week, which sounds like bad organization, but difficult to get people. one with Martha Hickey on the menopause, and one with Judy Hennigan on all sorts of things, but including the adolescent menstrual cohort that she's running in Bangladesh. So yeah, hopefully see you then. Thanks again, Bettina, and thanks everyone for coming. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
That was fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.